The date is July 31st, 1970, somewhere in the North Atlantic. Aboard a Royal Navy warship, a sailor stands in line at the grog tub for the last time. He holds a small metal cup, a tot, exactly 2.5 fluid ounces of rum, and he drinks it the way he has drunk it every single day of his naval career. The way his father did, the way sailors had done, every day for more than 300 years. Today, it ends. Some sailors that morning wear black armbands. Others have organized small ceremonies on deck, lowering their tot cups into the sea as though committing a shipmate to the deep. A few weep openly. They call this day Black Tot Day, and the grief is not performance. These men are not mourning a drink. They are mourning a ritual that had threaded itself through every war Britain ever fought at sea, through mutinies and victories and storms and sieges, through the age of sail and 2 world wars and everything in between. A cup of rum, 2.5 ounces, 300 years. But to understand why that cup could break a man's heart, why it mattered enough to cry over on the deck of a modern warship in 1970, you have to go back much further than the Royal Navy. You have to go back to a Caribbean island, a pile of rotting sugarcane waste, and an accident that nobody planned and nobody at the time thought would amount to anything at all. Most people, if they think about rum at all, think about it in one of 2 ways. They picture a pirate, or they picture a cocktail. Maybe both at once. And that is exactly the problem, because those images, fun as they are, have buried the actual story so thoroughly that most people have no idea what they are really looking at when they pick up a glass. Rum is not a beach drink. It is not a pirate affectation. It is the liquid architecture of the Atlantic world. For roughly 2 centuries, rum was the substance that made the slave trade financially viable, the fuel that powered colonial economies on 3 continents, the currency that bought human beings, and the grievance that, most historians would argue, set the American Revolution in motion before anyone had heard of a tea tax. It began as garbage. It became one of the most consequential substances in the history of human civilization, and it is still with us in ways most people never think to look for. To understand where rum came from, you first have to understand what sugar production actually looked like in the 17th century Caribbean, because rum was not invented so much as it was noticed. By the 1620s, Barbados had become a British colonial outpost, still searching for its identity. Tobacco had been tried and mostly failed. Cotton was unreliable. Then Dutch traders, many of them experienced in Brazilian sugar production, arrived with knowledge, equipment and financing, and within 2 decades Barbados had remade itself into a sugar island. Fields of sugarcane covered land that had been forest. Mills ran day and night. And enslaved Africans, imported in rapidly increasing numbers, did the work that made all of it possible. The process of refining sugar produces a byproduct. When cane juice is boiled down and the sugar crystals are extracted, what remains is a thick, dark, bittersweet liquid that drains away from the molds, molasses. In the early years of Caribbean sugar production, molasses was essentially waste. Planters did not know what to do with it. Some dumped it, some fed it to livestock. It accumulated in the heat, fermenting on its own, filling the air around the plantation with something sharp and strange. And someone, almost certainly an enslaved worker. Though the historical record does not give us a name or a date, notice that the fermented liquid had properties worth paying attention to. The earliest written reference to distilled cane spirit in the Caribbean comes from Barbados around 1647. A visitor described the drink in terms that were not exactly flattering. He called it rumbullion, which may have derived from a Devonshire English word for a brawl or uproar, or possibly from a French or Portuguese root. The etymology, like the drink itself, is murky. What is not murky is what the document says about its effects: powerful and not always pleasant. But powerful was enough. Powerful was, in fact, exactly what a sugar island needed, because rum, from its very first moments, was not really about pleasure. It was about utility. It was cheap to produce. The raw material was literally the waste product of the sugar process, which meant that rum cost plantation owners almost nothing to make. It kept for a long time without spoiling. It could be traded. It could be used as wages. And in a colonial Caribbean economy that was always short on coin and long on labor needs, a substance with all of those properties was not going to stay local for long. For the first few decades, that was more or less the extent of its reach, a rough colonial spirit drunk by sailors, servants, and the enslaved, dismissed by European elites who preferred wine or brandy. It was a regional curiosity, a byproduct of a byproduct. Then it entered the trading system. And everything changed. To explain what happened next, you need to picture a triangle. Not a metaphor, an actual trade route running between 3 points: the Caribbean, West Africa, and the American colonies, and Europe. Historians call it the triangle trade, and rum was not incidental to it. Rum was the mechanism that made it turn. Here is how the machine worked. Caribbean sugar plantations produced two things: sugar, which went to Europe, and molasses, which went north to the American colonies, particularly to New England, where by the early 1700s distilleries had sprung up across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. These distilleries converted the molasses into rum with remarkable efficiency. At its peak, Rhode Island alone had dozens of distilleries operating simultaneously. Boston had more. The rum they produced was cheaper and stronger than almost anything else available, and it moved in enormous quantities. Some of that rum went straight into colonial consumption. But a significant portion, and this is where the machine reveals its true shape, was loaded onto ships and sent to the west coast of Africa. There, rum served as currency. It was traded alongside iron goods, textiles, and firearms for enslaved human beings. African rulers and traders who participated in the slave trade accepted rum as payment. British and American slave traders stocked their ships with it as the primary medium of exchange. By some estimates, rum accounted for a significant share of the purchasing power used to acquire enslaved Africans during the height of the transatlantic slave trade, though historians debate the exact proportions, which varied by era and by trading nation. Those enslaved people were then transported across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, to the Caribbean, where they were forced to work the sugar plantations. The plantations produced more sugar and more molasses. The molasses went north. More rum was made. More rum went to Africa. The triangle kept turning. What makes this system worth staring at directly is how deliberately self-reinforcing it was. Every element fed every other element. The waste product of sugar production funded the purchase of the labor that produced more sugar. Rum was not just a commodity inside this system. It was the connective tissue. It was what kept the triangle from being just a line between 2 points. And the scale of it was staggering. By the middle of the 18th century, the colonies were importing millions of gallons of molasses annually. Hundreds of distilleries were in operation. Rum was the most commonly consumed spirit in North America by a wide margin. It was drunk at breakfast in some households, mixed with water or cider, or simply neat. It was given to laborers as part of their daily wages. It was present at elections, at funerals, at ship launchings. In some parts of colonial New England, it was more reliably available than clean water. This is the kind of story we dig into every week on this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. But even as rum was becoming the economic backbone of the colonial Atlantic, something darker was happening inside the plantation system itself. Because rum was not only being used to purchase enslaved people, it was also being used to control them. The relationship between rum and slavery is not one chapter of the story. It is threaded through every chapter. But it is worth pausing here at the height of the triangle trade to look at it directly, because the scale and the mechanism of what rum enabled is something that tends to get softened in popular tellings, and it should not be. Enslaved people on Caribbean sugar plantations worked in conditions that most contemporary accounts describe in terms that are difficult to read. The sugar harvest, the season called crop time, ran nearly without pause. Mills operated day and night. Injuries from the grinding machinery were common. The heat was punishing. The death rate on many plantations was high enough that plantation owners in the Caribbean factored the cost of replacing enslaved workers into their operating budgets. This was not a secret. It was an accounting practice. Rum entered this system in several ways simultaneously. On one end of the trade, as we have seen, it was the currency that purchased human beings on the West African coast. On the other end, inside the plantation itself, small rations of rum were sometimes distributed to enslaved workers, particularly during crop time when the physical demands were most extreme. Planters and overseers used rum both as a minimal reward and, in some documented cases, as a way to dull the capacity for organized resistance. Most historians are careful to note that this practice varied significantly between plantations and islands, and that enslaved people developed their own relationships to rum that existed entirely outside planter control. Using it in ceremonies, in community gatherings, in the preservation of cultural practices that survived the Middle Passage. The point is not that rum made slavery possible. Slavery had existed long before rum, and the plantation system ran on violence and law, not on any single commodity. The more precise claim, which the historical record does support, is that rum made the triangle trade more efficient and more profitable than it would otherwise have been. It lowered the transaction costs of the slave trade on the African coast. It helped finance the expansion of the plantation system. And the profits from rum distillation, particularly in New England, helped build the merchant class and the port cities that would later, with considerable historical irony, produce some of the loudest voices against British colonial taxation. The people who built fortunes on rum in Boston and Newport were not, for the most part, questioning the system that produced their molasses. They were, however, about to start questioning who had the right to tax it. In 1733, the British Parliament passed the Molasses Act. On paper, it was a trade regulation. In practice, it was a declaration of economic war against the American colonies, and almost nobody in London seemed to fully understand what they were doing. The logic behind the act was straightforward from a British imperial perspective. The American colonies had been buying cheap molasses from French and Dutch Caribbean islands rather than from British-controlled plantations. British sugar planters, who had powerful lobbying influence in Parliament, wanted that stopped. The Molasses Act imposed a heavy duty on all foreign molasses entering the colonies, 6 pence per gallon, which was high enough to make the French and Dutch product effectively unaffordable if the tax were actually enforced. It was not enforced. Almost universally, colonial merchants ignored it. Smuggling networks that had always existed simply expanded. Customs officials in Boston, Newport, and New York accepted bribes as a matter of professional routine. The rum distilleries kept running on cheap foreign molasses, and the British government, distracted by wars in Europe, mostly looked the other way. But something had shifted. The Molasses Act established a principle that colonists found intolerable: that Parliament could reach directly into colonial economic life and restructure it for the benefit of a lobbying interest 3,000 miles away. The Act was widely ignored, but it was not forgotten. It sat in the background of colonial political consciousness for 30 years, a dormant grievance waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1764, when Parliament passed the Revenue Act, often called the Sugar Act, which actually attempted to enforce a modified molasses tax. The rate was lower than 1733, but this time the British government meant it. Customs enforcement was strengthened, smugglers faced real consequences, and the colonial response was immediate and furious. Here is the historical argument worth making carefully, because it is contested but compelling. The American Revolution is most commonly remembered as beginning with the Stamp Act of 1765 and igniting with the Boston Tea Party of 1773. But a significant number of historians argue that the deeper structural grievance, the one that made colonial merchants and political leaders receptive to revolutionary arguments in the first place, was the molasses tax. Rum was the economic engine of New England. An attack on molasses was an attack on the entire colonial commercial order. By the time Sam Adams was writing pamphlets about taxation without representation, he was writing to an audience that had already been economically radicalized by a decade of fighting over a sticky brown liquid. John Adams, late in his life, put it with characteristic bluntness. Molasses, he suggested, was an essential ingredient in American independence. He was not speaking metaphorically. He meant that the economic chain, molasses, rum, trade, taxation, resentment, revolution, was as real and as consequential as any philosophical argument about liberty. The tea gets remembered. The rum gets forgotten. But the rum came first. While the American colonies were turning their rum grievances into revolution, the British Royal Navy was doing something entirely different with the same substance. It was building a 300-year institution around it. The Navy's relationship with rum began not in the Caribbean, but in the practical reality of long ocean voyages. The standard naval ration in the early 17th century included beer, large quantities of it, because beer was safer to drink than the water stored in wooden barrels, which turned foul within weeks at sea. But beer took up enormous space, went bad on long voyages, and was expensive to produce in sufficient quantities for a fleet. When British naval operations expanded into the Caribbean in the mid-1600s, a practical substitution presented itself. Rum was cheap, abundant, and did not spoil. Admiral William Penn, father of the founder of Pennsylvania, is often credited with introducing rum rations to the Navy after the conquest of Jamaica in 1655, though the exact history is somewhat blurred by legend. What is not blurred is what the ration became. By the early 18th century, every British sailor received a daily half pint of rum, later reduced to a quarter pint, issued in 2 portions, diluted with water into what was called grog, named after Admiral Edward Vernon, who ordered the dilution in 1740 and whose nickname was Old Grog, after the grogram cloak he habitually wore. The grog ration was not a perk. It was a structural feature of naval life, written into regulations, timed to the ship's bell, and defended by sailors with a ferocity that admirals learned not to casually challenge. The legend attached to rum and the Navy that has proven most durable and most disputed involves Admiral Horatio Nelson. After his death at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the story goes that Nelson's body was preserved in a barrel of rum for the voyage back to England. Sailors, so the legend continues, bored holes in the barrel and drank from it during the crossing, which is why Navy rum came to be called Nelson's blood. Most historians regard the drinking from the barrel part as almost certainly apocryphal. The barrel preservation is documented. The rest has the feel of a story that sailors decided was too good not to be true. True or not, the legend tells you something real about the relationship between the Navy and rum. It was intimate enough that sailors built mythology around it. Rum was not just a ration. It was identity. It was the daily marker of belonging to the service, the ritual that separated naval life from civilian life, the thing that made a bad watch bearable and a good one better. When the tot was finally abolished on July 31, 1970, the Admiralty citing concerns about safety in an era of complex machinery and nuclear technology, the reaction aboard ships was not resignation. It was genuine mourning. Sailors held those deckside funerals. They lowered their tot cups into the sea. Some senior ratings refused to speak about it at all, treating the whole subject with the silence reserved for real losses. 315 years of daily ritual ended by a parliamentary vote. The last tot was poured. The grog tub was retired. And rum, which had sailed with the British Navy through every war from the Anglo-Dutch conflicts of the 17th century to the Second World War, was suddenly just a drink again. The 20th century did not treat rum kindly, at least not at first. In the United States, which had been one of rum's great historical homelands, Prohibition arrived in 1920 and dismantled the distilling industry almost entirely. American rum had never fully recovered from the disruptions of the Revolutionary War period, when the cutting of British molasses supply chains had forced colonists toward domestically produced grain whiskies. By the time Prohibition hit, rum was already a secondary spirit in the American market. The 13-year ban finished what the Revolution had started. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the American spirits industry rebuilt itself around bourbon and rye. Rum was largely left behind. What saved rum's global reputation and in some ways transformed it into the drink most people recognize today was a combination of two things: the Caribbean tourism industry and a Catalan-born Cuban distiller named Facundo Bacard, whose family's company had been refining rum production techniques since the 1860s. The Bacard approach: lighter, cleaner, more palatable to European and American tastes than the heavy rums of the earlier colonial era, coincided neatly with the mid-20th century American fascination with tropical escapism. The daiquiri, the mojito, the rum and Coke, which became one of the best-selling cocktail combinations in the world, partly because Bacard and Coca-Cola, in what most advertising historians regard as one of the shrewder marketing partnerships of the century, actively promoted it together. The tiki movement of the 1940s and 1950s, the elaborately themed bars with their carved wooden figures and their layered fruit-laden drinks, completed the transformation. Rum, which had once been the financial instrument of the slave trade and the daily ration of an imperial navy, was now officially a vacation. It was something you drank with a paper umbrella in it. The history had been successfully buried under enough pineapple juice that most people stopped thinking to look for it. But in the Caribbean itself, the story was more complicated. For the islands where rum was actually produced, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Cuba, Martinique, Guadeloupe, rum was never just a cocktail ingredient. It was, and remains, something closer to a cultural inheritance. The specific styles of rum produced on different islands reflect histories as distinct as the islands themselves. Jamaican rum, with its heavy, funky, ester-rich profile, traces its character to production methods developed largely by enslaved and formerly enslaved workers over centuries. Martinican rum agricole, made from fresh cane juice rather than molasses and protected by a French appellation system similar to the one used for wine and cheese, is a direct expression of a particular island's terroir and colonial history. Barbadian rum, which has the strongest claim to being the original, carries with it the specific geography and agricultural tradition of the island where the whole story began. When Caribbean nations began achieving independence through the mid-20th century, Trinidad in 1962, Barbados in 1966, Jamaica in 1962, rum became, for many of them, one of the few economic and cultural assets that was genuinely and indigenously theirs. It had been created on their land by their ancestors under conditions of extreme violence and dispossession. The question of what to do with that inheritance, how to claim it, how to market it, how to tell its history honestly while also building an industry around it, is one that Caribbean producers and governments are still working through. The craft rum revival of the last 2 decades has made this question more urgent. As small batch distillers in Europe, North America, and the Caribbean itself have begun producing rums with the same seriousness previously reserved for single malt whiskey or aged cognac, and as rum enthusiasts have started reading labels and asking questions about provenance, the full history of the spirit has become harder to keep buried. Consumers who want to know where their rum comes from are, whether they realize it or not, asking a question that goes back to Barbados in the 1620s, to the West African coast, to the hold of a slave ship, to a New England distillery, to the deck of a Royal Navy warship in the North Atlantic. The answer is always the same history. What changes is how much of it people are willing to look at. On the morning of July 31st, 1970, a Royal Navy sailor lowered a small metal cup into the sea. It was a gesture of mourning, and it was also, without anyone quite meaning it to be, a gesture of forgetting. What went into the water with that cup was not just a tradition. It was 3.5 centuries of a story that runs through the worst and most consequential chapters of Atlantic history. The sugar plantation, the slave ship, the colonial distillery, the smuggler's warehouse in Boston Harbor, the negotiating table on the West African coast where a human being's life was exchanged for a barrel of liquid. Rum was present at all of it. Not as a symbol, as the actual financial and logistical mechanism that held those systems together and kept them running. We tend to remember history through its most dramatic images. The tea going into Boston Harbor, the slave ship diagram with its rows of figures, the naval battle, the political pamphlet, the founding document. What we remember less well is the infrastructure of ordinary commerce underneath those images, the trade goods and the currencies and the everyday transactions that made the dramatic moments possible. Rum was that infrastructure. It was the thing that made the triangle trade financially viable. It was the grievance that preceded the revolution. It was the daily ritual that held a navy together across 3 centuries of warfare. And it is still here. It is in the bottle on the back bar, in the cocktail at the resort, in the aged spirit that a collector in London just paid several £100s for at auction. It is in the protected appellations of Martinique and the estate bottlings of Barbados and the heavy pours of Jamaican distilleries that have been operating on the same land, using refinements of the same techniques for longer than the United States has existed. The next time you encounter rum, in whatever form, in whatever context, you are holding something that passed through the hands of sailors and slavers and revolutionaries and pirates and Navy admirals and colonial merchants and Caribbean farmers and New England distillers and West African traders. You are holding a substance that built fortunes and broke people and changed the map of the world. That is what was in the cup. That is what they lowered into the sea. Next time you pour a rum, you'll probably think about this differently. Subscribe for more hidden histories and let us know in the comments which chapter of this one hit hardest for you.